This video is made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.
In the 1990s, HAL Laboratory was more closely intertwining themselves with Nintendo. Sure, the company seemed to favor the NES through the 1980s, but it wasn't really until the 1990s when they partnered with Nintendo to release Kirby's Dream Land on the Game Boy that HAL Labs became Nintendo exclusive. After HAL worked with Nintendo to release Super Nintendo games ranging from Earthbound to the late 1997 release Kirby's Dream Land 3, the burgeoning studio, headed up by future Nintendo president Satoru Iwata, started working on the Nintendo 64, albeit maybe a little later than other Nintendo teams. HAL's first Nintendo 64 project was SimCopter 64, though that quietly went away after a brief showing at E3 1997. What would later become their first Nintendo 64 release was first developed as a 64DD title focused on taking pictures. Iwata said in a Iwata Asks for Kirby's Epic Yarn that originally Pokemon Snap wasn't a Pokemon game, but rather a normal game in which you took photos. The motivation for playing the game wasn't clear. Later on, we made a somewhat forced switch to taking pictures of Pokemon. The story behind the transition from a simple photography game to one with Pokemon was recently touched on in the book Ask Iwata. Shigeru Miyamoto recounts working on Pokemon Snap with the late Nintendo luminary. According to Miyamoto, Iwata stressed that while a game where you take photos was a decent start, what really mattered was what you could photograph. Miyamoto further recalled another conversation where Iwata just plainly told him, "I think it's Pokemon. That's what people really want to photograph." The book also confirms that the Jack and the Beanstalk game that HAL Laboratory was working on in the mid-90s evolved into Pokemon Snap. Little is known about the Jack and the Beanstalk game other than it was an experimental game that was in development for the 64DD during the 90s. Development got rocky until Iwata brought the Pokemon inspiration. With all of that, Pokemon Snap was born, and the team at HAL, led by Yoichi Yamamoto, got to work on the Pokemon-themed photography game. Late in development, it left its 64DD dreams behind due to lacking sales of the Japan-only peripheral. Pokemon Snap launched in March 1999 in Japan, followed up by releases that fall in other regions. Pokemon Snap wasn't solely a solo HAL Labs joint though. Assisting them was Pax Sofnica, a little-known developer that worked a lot with Nintendo in the 90s. The Japan-centric studio mostly made games for Nintendo that never crossed over to other shores, like the Famicom games Shin Onogashima and Mother, though the later game would eventually come out as Earthbound Beginnings on the Wii U Virtual Console. The late 90s were prolific for the team, and also the end of their relationship with Nintendo. In a few years, they worked on Earthbound, Donkey Kong 94, Wrecking Crew 98, Mole Mania, and Balloon Kid. Pokemon Snap was one of their last projects they worked on with Nintendo. The original Pokemon Snap team is likely not really at HAL anymore. Yamamoto, who didn't have a traditional game development background to begin with, stayed around the company for quite a while. The last credit we can find for him is around 2015, when he was highlighted as one of the key creators designing Amiibo and other products at Nintendo. More than 2 decades after Snap's debut, the spin-off is close to returning on Nintendo Switch as New Pokemon Snap. This once seemed impossible, but it's actually happening. The Pokemon Company is working on the game with Bandai Namco, headed up by the director of Pokken Tournament, Haruki Sasaki. He's been with Bandai Namco since, well, around the time when the first Pokemon Snap launched, coincidentally. In addition to Pokken, he's also helped with other fighting games, such as Soul Calibur and Tekken. A photography game is new territory, but basically any game developer would be entering new territory with a photography game. Unlike with the original game, which required Iwata having a eureka moment about the subject of your photographs, the concept for New Pokemon Snap is already settled. Bandai Namco seems to be executing on the original idea, retaining the on-rails nature and interactive charm of the Nintendo 64 classic. Time will tell if this new entry will be as memorable as its 22-year-old ancestor.
This video is made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.